First of all, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Natalie Walker. I'm the manager of college operations here at the Classic Learning Test. For anyone familiar with these seminars, you've heard me say it before, but for anyone unfamiliar with the CLT, we are a college entrance exam and assessment suite for grades 7 through 12. One thing that distinguishes the CLT as a test is its content. Most of the passages on any CLT exam come from our author bank. This is a list comprised of men and women who have contributed to the richness of philosophy and thought that we've inherited. They're authors you're likely to encounter in your college career, and hopefully you'll engage with them throughout your life. So most Thursdays of the academic year, to help us develop a true common canon with each other, a faculty member from one of our partner colleges helps us explore one author from the CLT bank. Our author tonight is none other than William Shakespeare, whose birthday was the 23rd, very recently. And our college partner is a dear one, Abilene Christian University. Doing these introductions, I love it when a university knows itself well enough and uses words so thoughtfully and well that I can just read their mission statement as an introduction to them. And I'll do that with Abilene Christian. Abilene's mission is to educate students for Christian service and leadership throughout the world. They achieve their mission through exemplary teaching offered by an innovative and caring community of Christian scholars that inspires a commitment to lifelong learning, significant research grounded in the university's disciplinary strengths that informs and impacts issues of global importance to the academy, church, and society, and meaningful service as a divine calling that enriches our global society, academic disciplines, the university, and the church to God's glory. With us tonight is Dr. Joseph Stephenson, a professor of English at Abilene Christian University, where he teaches courses in Shakespeare and British literature, both on campus in Abilene, Texas, and for ACU's study abroad program in Oxford. He earned his BA from Yale and his PhD from the University of Connecticut. Dr. Stephenson was privileged to work with renowned Shakespearean scholar Andrew Gurr on his doctoral dissertation, which examined Dutch characters on the English stage from Shakespeare to Dryden. He continues to publish on the intersections of Anglo-Dutch geopolitical relations and early modern drama, as well as regularly reviewing Shakespeare productions at Shakespeare's Globe in London and at the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford-upon-Avon for scholarly journals. Dr. Stephenson has also worked as a dramaturgical consultant for several theater companies in Texas. His current major research project is a scholarly edition of The Dutch Lady, a formerly lost restoration comedy existing in a single manuscript from the 17th century. We're so lucky to have him here tonight. After the lecture, there will be time for questions, so keep your questions close and we'll be fielding those from the chat. They can be about Shakespeare and the First Folio, could be about Shakespeare, not the First Folio. They could be about Abilene Christian. We look forward to hearing them. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Stephenson. Screen is yours.
Thank you, Natalie, for that kind introduction. Greetings to everyone attending here tonight on April 27th or watching later. I'm going to share my screen. We practiced this earlier, so it's sure to work properly now. There we go. And I'm going to try to stop the screen share a couple of times during the talk as well, rather than just keep the same slide sitting up there for a while. But we're hoping for the best that I can make the technology work, even though it may be a little bit clunky. So it's absolutely my honor to speak on the topic of Shakespeare, an author who has taken up much of my attention ever since I first encountered him in high school, quite a few years ago, let's say. I'm giving this lecture on April 27th, 2023, so we are still in the week of Shakespeare's birthday, what we consider Shakespeare's birthday and death day, April 23rd. So I want to begin the lecture tonight with a very brief rundown of what we know about Shakespeare's birth and death before I get to my main topic, the First Folio of Shakespeare's plays. So what we have here is an image from the official church registry of Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon. That is the Shakespeare's home church in Stratford-upon-Avon. And you can see here, I think you can still see my mouse as I'm screen sharing here. that we have in 1564, on April the 26th, this says in Latin, Guillermus Filius Johannes Shakespeare. And someone put 3 X's over here in the margin to make sure that we noticed it. That means William, son of John Shakespeare. So the baptism on April 26th. But then why do we celebrate April 23rd as the actual birthday? Well, here's some information about that. Obviously, since the baptismal record is for Wednesday, April 26th, then Shakespeare was born on or before that date, really before that date. April 23rd was a Sunday in 1564. Was a Sunday in 1564, making it unlikely that Shakespeare was born before April 23rd. It was not recommended to let a Sunday pass between birth and baptism. We also know that it was just fairly common practice to baptize an infant on or around the 3rd day after birth. And also, the first time anyone ever mentions such a thing as Shakespeare's birthday, it's noted in the 1700s as April 23rd. A well-known day in England. It happens to be St. George's Day. St. George is the patron saint of England. All right, and now moving very quickly ahead to the funeral of William Shakespeare. That was quick. In April of 1616, on the 25th, someone has placed only 1 X here for our noticing, 25, Will Shakespeare, gentleman. William Shakespeare, gentleman. Okay, so the funeral is April 25th. What does that tell us? Obviously, he was not, he died on or after, since his funeral was on April 25th, he did not die on that date, nor after that date. It was very common for a funeral to be held on the 2nd day after death. And here is, in fact, the place where Shakespeare is buried. This is the area of the altar at Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon. Here is William Shakespeare's grave over toward the door there. Here is a monument, a funerary monument of Shakespeare, up there on the side of the church wall. Here's the altar, by the way, on the far right of your screen. So the burial monument contains important evidence for us to look at. Here's a close-up of the funerary monument. There it is. I've actually got a photo of the funerary monument behind me, which you certainly can't see, but you can see the image on your screen now. This, by the way, is probably a decent likeness of Shakespeare, since it was put up only a few years after he died, and since his family members were still alive and could give advice as to how he looked. But what is more interesting to us today is the writing here, not this Latin inscription and not this English poem, which was almost certainly not by Shakespeare. It's not very good. But way down in the right-hand corner, I'm sure you can't read it, this Latin inscription in the very bottom right. I've got a better way to view it here. Well, even on this, there we go. There's the writing underneath the Shakespeare bust there. And it says, if you can possibly read it, obiit anno Doi, that's anno Domini, 1616, aetatis. Actually, I'll just go to the next slide here. So, obiit anno Domini 1616, that means died in the year of our Lord, 1616, in his 53rd year, on the 23rd day of April. Aha. Now, there we go. That's some evidence we can use, because I've mentioned already that we can believe the image and the writing that's on this monument. But my second bullet point, the monument says that the death day was April 23rd, 1616. No ifs, ands, or buts. Now, since the monument states that Shakespeare was in his 53rd year when he died on April 23rd, that means he had already reached his 52nd birthday. In other words, he was not born on the 24th or 25th of April before he was baptized on the 26th. He had to have been born on the 23rd or earlier. But going back to what we said earlier, if Shakespeare had been born on April 22nd or earlier, that would have meant his parents let a rather large span of time go by before the baptism, including Sunday, April 23rd. And since April 23rd was such a special day, it was both a Sunday and St. George's Day in 1564, then it's very unlikely they would have let that go. St. George's Day was considered a very lucky day to be baptized, and so they would have moved heaven and earth to get to church to baptize the kid. Thus, we know he was not born after April 23rd. We think that he was probably not born before April 23rd, which leaves exactly one day, April 23rd, as the traditional date, which is very likely correct. We can't know for certain, of course, but as certain as we can be that April 23rd is probably his birthday. And now, while we're there in the church, we might as well look at a rather neat, tidy gravestone here. It has the black velvet cord around it. It has the plaque with Shakespeare's name and coat of arms. And this lowest picture here is what the grave looks like on the Saturday closest to April 23rd each year, when, if you're in town, you're invited to join the Shakespeare parade. And the parade ends with a march through the church, and everybody is carrying flowers to honor Shakespeare. You hand those to a church warden who lays them on or near the grave. And there can actually just be piles and piles of flowers. These have been sort of cleaned up a little bit, but it's just a massive pile of flowers there. And if you know anything about Shakespeare's grave, you probably remember this bit, that on the gravestone is carved this interesting poem. It's in the form of a curse, really, a blessing and a curse. Good friend, for Jesus' sake, forbear to dig the dust and close it here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. So that's what's written on Shakespeare's grave. You may have heard that before. Now we're going to move on to my main topic today, the First Folio. The First Folio was published 7 years after Shakespeare's death in 1623. So that was indeed 400 years ago. If you look online, there's a lot of celebrations this year of the 400th anniversary of the First Folio and just how important that book is. The First Folio attempts to be a complete edition of the plays Shakespeare wrote, though a couple are missing. Some of the plays in the First Folio had been published before in a different, cheaper format called a quarto. But of the 36 plays published in the First Folio, 18 of them were published for the first time. So fully half of the plays in this book were published for the first time, and it's very possible we would never know of some of these plays if not for the First Folio. So that's why it's important. I think I'll stop sharing my screen for just a second and be more present with you. Okay, that seemed to work. The word folio means leaf in Latin, leaf or page in Latin, and a folio book was published on full unfolded pages that could easily be sort of stacked on top of each other. Yeah, we can make a great big book with lots and lots of pages, and then you could sort of glue it on the left-hand margin, or you could, and then you could buy or make a cover out of leather or wood to help protect the book. The First Folio had a run of about 275 copies. That does not sound like a lot by our standards, but remember, only a small minority of people in Shakespeare's day could read. Neither of Shakespeare's parents could read, for example, so they probably didn't buy a book. Also, they were dead, so they certainly didn't buy one, but only a small minority of people in Shakespeare's day could read. And also remember that the book was very expensive, about 18 or 20 shillings, which would be, it's hard to compare, but maybe $200 or $300. So No wonder not as many people bought it. So I'm going to go back to screen sharing. Give me just a second here. It takes a minute to share screen here because of all the wonderful technology there. I hope I'm sharing screen now. So the first folio was.
We're not seeing, or I'm not seeing the screen.
Thank you. Let's see. Let's go back to Zoom and let's push share. Oh, I forgot to push share. Your screen share is loading. That's nice. Am I sharing now, Natalie?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
It's not full screen yet, but we can see it.
There we go. Thank you so much. I don't know why it's being very difficult today, but the first folio was put together, we might say edited, by John Hemming and Henry Condell. So you can see here's some very fancy covers, 2 examples of the fancy covers you could put on your first folio. And here the book is open to the frontispiece, that famous engraving of Shakespeare, and a little tiny poem by Ben Jonson here. But going on, this is a letter to the readers by John Hemming and Henry Condell. Those were 2 of Shakespeare's close friends and collaborators in the theater company they all worked for together. Hemming and Condell gathered some other material for the front besides the plays. There are some wonderful poems. Several of the poems talk about an idea circulating in 1623 about possibly digging Shakespeare's grave up, take those remains to Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, but we know why that never happened, don't we? Cursed be he that moves my bones. One very famous poem by Shakespeare's frenemy, Ben Jonson, the same guy who wrote the tiny poem on the across from the frontispiece, he wrote a very long poem that appeared later, a couple of pages later. Ben Jonson, in one part of that poem, praises Shakespeare as better than the Latin and Greek playwrights, while also getting a jab in at Shakespeare, who never went to university, saying he knew only small Latin and less Greek. But here's another little bit of the poem right here toward the end. Jonson calls Shakespeare the sweet swan of Avon. The town of Stratford-upon-Avon was famous then and is famous now for the many swans that live there. Jonson notes that Shakespeare's works were played on the banks of the River Thames. You see that? And he notes that the plays so did take Eliza and our James. That's Queen Elizabeth I and King James I, who both saw dozens of performances of Shakespeare's plays. Now here's a little bit of info about a couple of specific copies of Shakespeare folios. First, here's the first folio. Let's see, there we go. Here is the copy of the first folio that has been located in the Free Library of Philadelphia for many years. Only a few years ago, Professor Jason Scott Warren from Cambridge University in England and Dr. Claire M.L. Byrne from Penn State University in Pennsylvania studied the markings in this book to figure out a little bit more about whoever had made the markings in this copy of the folio. You can see some of these markings here on the center left. After the finis, after the end of Measure for Measure, but before actually, this is a different piece of writing, but this is some writing from this guy who had owned this first folio. It was obviously a very educated person. The person had marked allusions to Greek and Latin stories. The passages the owner marked were not just the famous lines of Shakespeare, but a lot of obscure things. And finally, these 2 great scholars, one older in England, one younger in Pennsylvania, announced that this copy of the first folio had been owned by John Milton, the author of Paradise Lost, and someone I'm sure you can hear more about in another CLT lecture. And he made a lot of notes in his copy of the first folio, and we're actually going to read some of those later. By the way, let me mention right now that there was a second folio 9 years later in 1632, a third folio in 1663, reprinted in 1664, and a fourth folio in 1685. I'm going to show you right now a copy of the second folio. And this copy was actually owned by King Charles I, who reigned from 1625 to the 1640s. You can see over on the left margin here of your screen, you can see that Charles has helpfully put some notes near some of his favorite plays. Next to the title, Much Ado About Nothing, he has written Benedick and Beatrice. Next to Twelfth Night, he has written Malvolio, reminding himself of his favorite part of that play. Now let's look at a clearer copy of the table of contents. Now, like I said, this is a second folio, but now we're back to the anniversary of the first folio. This is one, if I'm not mistaken, this is a first folio that is held at it's held at a university in the States, but I don't want to say for fear that I might get it wrong. So you notice that the first folio here includes 3 genres. We have comedies, histories, and tragedies. Okay, let's keep in mind that these genres don't mean exactly what we might think of today for Shakespeare. A comedy doesn't necessarily mean that the play is filled with laughs, though some are, but the play moves from disorder to order, from chaos to unity, reinforcing the social order, usually with a wedding or 3 or 4 at the end. A history presents events from the past, yes, but not necessarily in the exact historical order or with exact historical accuracy. One thing it absolutely does do is to show the current ruler of England, who for Shakespeare would have been Elizabeth I up till 1603, and James I afterwards, in a good light, as well as any of their ancestors. We are more familiar with the classical definition of tragedy these days than of history or comedy. In a tragedy, there is an ending in chaos and ruin for the tragic hero. The tragic hero has been brought down by some of their own failings and has learned something during the play. The subject matter of a tragedy is political. It involves some sort of political problem which must be solved during the course of the play. And let me just say before I leave those 3 genres that all 3 genres end with a little bit of a buttoning up, a little bit of everything's going to go on, everything's going to be okay. The comedies have been moving toward order the whole way. The histories, well, we know that history marches on and everything's going to be all right. And the tragedies, they do have at least a sense that we know what's coming in the future after the tragedy is over. But I'm glad that Hemming and Condell chose to start the folio out with comedies. Shakespeare's comedies are performed more often than his tragedies nowadays, especially at free or cheap Shakespeare outdoors events. Probably many of you listening to me right now will have the chance to go see a Shakespeare comedy, Much Ado About Nothing, Midsummer Night's Dream, The Tempest, this summer, somewhere near where you live. Also, just by the way, I think that comedies should be taught more in schools. They're already performed more, but they should be taught more. Things are changing a bit now, but for many, many years, the standard Shakespeare curriculum in high schools has included exactly 4 tragedies: Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar, Macbeth, and Hamlet. Does that sound familiar to some of you? I don't think that high schoolers should get the idea that Shakespeare is always so depressing or somehow think that Shakespeare is the most serious author ever. Shakespeare is the most successful author ever. There are very few authors from 400 years ago whose works are still performed. And the comedies are big crowd pleasers, which is why they're performed so often. So let's start our whirlwind discussion of the 3 genres included in the first folio by looking at one of the plays that we would not have today except for the folio, and that is Twelfth Night. Here's the title design for Twelfth Night, or what you will, from the first folio. By the way, I'll mention first of all that the title Twelfth Night refers to the 12th night of Christmas celebrations, a time marked by very determined partying. and games that involved disguises and role-playing. And we see some of that in the play as well. But the plot of the play, Twelfth Night, involves a pair of twins, a young man, Sebastian, and a young woman, Viola. The ship they are sailing on wrecks, and each is washed up on shore on different beaches in the land of Illyria, which would be modern-day Croatia. We meet Viola first, and she is distraught at the thought that she can't find her brother, whom she assumes is drowned. So, left alone in a strange part of the world, she decides her safest course of action would be to disguise herself as a young man and go attach herself as a servant to the household or local duke named Orsino. Her name in disguise is Cesario. Orsino takes a liking to Cesario and sends him to carry love messages to the woman he is hopelessly in love with, the Countess Olivia. Olivia, though, has no interest in Orsino. She says she's still mourning the loss of her father and her brother, who both died perhaps a year earlier. Nevertheless, she quickly falls in love with the handsome young Cesario. Perhaps you can see the problem here, but indeed, Viola, disguised as Cesario, has already fallen in love with Orsino, the duke she serves. I've got a couple of images here on the left from the wonderful Trevor Nunn film of Twelfth Night from a few years back. You see Sebastian and Viola, who do in fact look quite a bit alike. Good job on the hair and makeup there. And this picture in the center, which was used for publicity in the film, shows Olivia in the center with Cesario on her right and Orsino on her left. So that's a really great love triangle, very, very funny situation. But Shakespeare is not finished yet with the complications in this play. In Twelfth Night, there are no fewer than 5 people that the play presents as possible matches for Olivia. That's impressive, even for Shakespeare. Besides Orsino and Cesario, I'll mention one more. Olivia has a steward, a butler, let's say, named Malvolio. Remember that name from Charles I's copy of the Second Folio? And Malvolio is a Puritan. Lots of playwrights in Shakespeare's day like to make fun of the Puritans, partly because the Puritans did not support the idea of theater at all. They were not happy with the idea that, for example, the young male apprentices between the ages of 11 and 21 were dressed as women to present the female parts in plays, since it was considered inappropriate, though not technically illegal, for women to appear on stage. In any case, Olivia's Puritan steward Malvolio breaks up a party at which the characters Toby, Olivia's uncle, and his friend Andrew, as well as the jester Feste, are celebrating Christmas, which the Puritans wanted nothing to do with, by the way. But Toby really puts Malvolio in his place. He says, "Dost thou think, because thou art virtuous, that there shall be no more cakes and ale?" Cakes and ale are the traditional treats associated with Twelfth Night celebrations. So to punish Malvolio, they play a trick on him, making him think, and this is the picture in the lower right of your screen, making Malvolio think that the Countess Olivia is in love with him. So he tries to court Olivia, makes an absolute fool of himself, and he is humiliated and basically tortured by the characters of Toby and Feste and a couple of others later in the play. No time to discuss that in detail right now, but let me just say that Shakespeare very often makes us feel empathy for characters that we, along with characters on stage, are very invested in disliking. Moving on to the histories now, which are not so often studied in the States. I think I'll mention one called Richard II. Shakespeare wrote 10 history plays, and 8 of them can be connected together into 2 groups of 4. Richard II starts off the second group of 4 plays. Richard II was king in the late 1300s. This was a very exciting time of history, and I think you know what exciting means. There was a lot of conflict, there were a lot of different kings, and there was some disagreement about who really should be king after all. But Richard II starts with King Richard, whom everybody agrees is the rightful king, sitting on the throne. However, he is seen as a weak king. He's very unpopular. He spends a lot of time hanging out with ne'er-do-wells rather than taking care of state business. For certain reasons, no time to mention right now, Richard banishes a man named Henry Bolingbroke for 7 years. But when Bolingbroke's father, the old and respected John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, starts to despair that he will never see his son again, he'll surely be dead in 7 years, Richard rather arbitrarily changes the sentence to 4 years, showing some Richard's weakness there. Here's a slide of Richard in the foreground and Bolingbroke in the background from the wonderful series The Hollow Crown from British TV a few years back. However, Bolingbroke does not wait 7 years. He does not wait 4 years. His father dies within a few months. And then Richard, rather than preserve Bolingbroke's father's lands and titles for Henry when he's able to return, Richard seizes these valuable assets to finance his ill-advised war in Ireland. When Henry learns of this, he returns, and it quickly becomes apparent that he will not be satisfied until he becomes king. This would have been a rather uncomfortable subject in Shakespeare's day. After all, there was a ruler sitting on the throne in 1595 when this play was first performed, whom many people did not want there. Her name was Queen Elizabeth I. Some people didn't want her on the throne because she was a woman. Others didn't want her on the throne because she was Protestant. But for whatever reason, there were many attempts to remove Elizabeth from the throne, usually by assassination. For one of these attempts, the group seeking to get Elizabeth to leave the throne actually came to Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlain's men, and asked them to put on Richard II right before they marched to the palace in order to remind Londoners that seemingly sometimes it's okay to throw a ruler off the throne and replace them. The attempt failed, by the way, largely due to the poise and quick thinking of Elizabeth herself. But there is a story from years later in which the keeper of the Royal Archives at the Tower of London presented Elizabeth with a list of lots of information about different rulers. And when they came to Richard II, Elizabeth looked at the librarian and said, "I am Richard II. Know ye not that?" It's also worth noting that although there were several quartos of Richard II, those cheaper single volume editions about the size of a paperback, we might say, although there were several quartos of Richard II published, the scene in which Richard is actually deposed and gives up the crown to Henry was never published until after Elizabeth's death. You see this quarto from 1615 that says, "with new additions of the Parliament scene and the deposing of King Richard." So that was some dicey stuff that could not be printed. Who knows if it could even be performed when Elizabeth was still alive. And now quickly, very quickly, on to the tragedies, which is the most popular genre to study nowadays. And since I've talked about two less familiar genres, and since for many of you, it might be even two plays you've never read before or know much about, I'll end with something very familiar, the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet. Even if you haven't read it, I'm sure you could tell me the story, right? Romeo and Juliet love each other, but they can't be together because their families are enemies, right? They end up committing suicide rather than face the cold realities of life, so love wins. And I'm here to tell you that that is not the story of Romeo and Juliet as Shakespeare tells it. That is the story of Romeo and Juliet in pop culture. But let's think a little bit more carefully about exactly what Shakespeare wrote. And we're going to go back to that folio that John Milton owned. And this is not the same slide, not the same page the book was open to before. This is the end of one of the tragedies. And John Milton has written up at the top of the page, the prologue of Juliet and Romeo. Okay, the prologue to Juliet and Romeo. And I think that Milton's writing is neat enough, and the photo taken by my friend Claire Byrne, one of the people who has who discovered that this was indeed John Milton. I think you can read John Milton's very neat handwriting down here in the bottom left. This is the play as Shakespeare tells it. Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene, from ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. For some reason or other, the prologue to the play is not present in the first folio. Probably that page had been damaged or gotten lost. But John Milton, he knew the prologue. He had access to it through a quarto edition, probably. So he copied it out for his, because he definitely wanted to include those beautiful lines in his copy of the first folio. So that's how Shakespeare tells the story. Those are the first 4 lines of the 14-line prologue. Yes, the prologue is actually a sonnet, if you notice, and not one word of Romeo or of Juliet or of a love story. The story that Shakespeare tells is the story of 2 households who have an ancient grudge, elsewhere in the play called Hatred, which has recently broken out into fresh fighting, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. The next 4 lines of the prologue explain how that ancient grudge, family feud, is solved. From forth the fatal loins of these 2 foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured, piteous overthrow doth with their death bury their parents' strife. So that's how Shakespeare views the love story. It's the way that the feud is finally stopped, but neither of the 2 lovers is mentioned by name here. And then when the play begins in earnest in Act 1, Scene 1, we see some very minor, unimportant characters, Samson, Gregory, Abram, talking about the feud, starting to fight. Then enter Benvolio and Tybalt, eventually old Capulet and old Montague. And the fight goes on and on for so long and so intensely that when the prince enters, it takes him 7 lines to get them to listen to his orders. He asks them several times to be quiet. And finally, after 7 lines, he demands that they throw their weapons to the ground. And that's how the play begins. And that's how the play ends, with the family feud. Romeo and Juliet are not in this scene. Interestingly, the play does not begin with Romeo and Juliet. We don't expect Juliet, a teenage girl, to be present for a fight, but Romeo is very conspicuously absent. His mother says, "Where is Romeo? I wonder where he is today." But let's remind ourselves why Romeo is not around during this opening scene. He's off in the orchard pouting over a girl, but not Juliet. Do you remember who Romeo is in love with at the beginning of this play? Rosaline. Yes, Rosaline. And after the party and the long chat that Romeo and Juliet have, when she is at her window, not her balcony, by the way, her window, and Romeo is down in the garden, and then Romeo goes off to talk to his friend and mentor, Friar Lawrence, about the situation. The friar assumes Romeo's been with Rosaline all night. Romeo tells him, "Oh no, I forgot that name." The friar is very harsh, criticizing Romeo. He says, "You're a young waverer." And he says some other things, but then a thought suddenly strikes him. In lots of old stories of political conflict, peace eventually is made through a marriage that unites the warring parties, right? And that's how the love story is presented. The reason Friar Lawrence agrees to assist the young lovers and to marry them is that he hopes that their union can help end the feud. And of course, it does, but not without the painful and sad deaths of Romeo and Juliet. At the end of the play, Capulet calls Romeo and Juliet poor sacrifices of our enmity. As the prologue had stated, the hatred was so intense between the families that naught but their children's end, in the form of a sacrifice, could remove it. Montague responds by offering to build a statue of true and faithful Juliet. Capulet says, "Well, I'll provide a statue of Romeo, and there will be a public memorial, which will serve as a reminder of the cost of the lasting peace." The prince ends the story, now that the feud is settled once and for all, with promises of justice and an instruction to the audience to go hence and have more talk of these sad things. Shakespeare insists that his audience talk about the important issues of his plays after leaving. The prince's last words strike our ears a bit funny. "For never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo. The reason why that sounds a bit forced to us is we've gotten used to the sound of the title as it is given in the table of contents, Romeo and Juliet, with the man's name first, as would be traditional. But I think the prince's odd rhyme of woe and Romeo encourages us, as we talk of these sad things, to think why Juliet's name is mentioned first in the last line. I think Shakespeare, and by the way, you remember that Milton had also said, he had said the prologue to Juliet and Romeo in his copy. But I think Shakespeare is giving us an indication that Juliet is actually the tragic hero of this play. Remember that Romeo's love is called into question as too changeable when he forgets Rosaline, quickly commits to Juliet. Also, remember that Juliet is the one to bring up marriage, the only honorable way that their love story could come to a fruition, while Romeo is prone to making rash vows, tries to swear by the moon, a proverbial symbol of change. It is Juliet who says, you can see here in the middle of the screen, my bounty is as boundless as the sea. My love is deep. The more I give to thee, the more I have, for both are infinite. This beautiful line of Juliet's is reminiscent of Psalm 36, in which God's love and goodness is compared to the ocean. Shakespeare broke several traditions in Romeo and Juliet. He included a love story, the traditional topic of a comedy, in his tragedy, and he described a woman's love and a woman's character as superior to a man's. As my time quickly comes to an end here, I'll wrap up by repeating that the First Folio is a massively important book, the only source that we have for about half of Shakespeare's plays. Sunday was, we're pretty sure, the 459th anniversary of Shakespeare's birth, the 407th anniversary of his death, and in November of this year, no ifs, ands, or buts, we will definitely reach the 400th anniversary of the publication of the First Folio. Its popularity helped secure the important place that Shakespeare has in English literature and the English language generally. The ideas in the plays, such as the ideas that marriage is supposed to be about love, not about money or politics, that comes from Shakespeare. The idea that a leader should more seek the common good than his own personal advancement. Those ideas have had immense influence in our culture 400 years later. There's a look at my sources. If you're watching this recording later, you can get a good view of those. But I urge you all to read or to go see all of the wonderful plays in this volume. You'll be a better person for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's fascinating. Anyone is welcome to ask questions in the chat and I'll pose them to Dr. Stephenson, but I'll start with my own. Right where you left off, actually, reading the plays. Do you have any advice, maybe especially for high school students? So a lot of folks on the call or watching the recording will be high school teachers, homeschool parents, high school students. Do you have any kind of general advice for them about reading the plays as plays?
Okay, that's a great question. Read the play as a play. First of all, if you can, go see the play. Even if it's a local production at a school. When my son was in junior high, he was in several Shakespeare plays. Guess what? They were not the best productions I've ever seen, but you can learn a lot more about the play when you see it than when you merely read it. There are some lines, there are some situations that you only fully understand it when you see it done on stage. So go see the plays. You probably have some free summer Shakespeare somewhere in your neighborhood or in your state, at least. Next time you go to England, next time you go to New York or Washington, make sure that you schedule a visit to a theater to see a Shakespeare play. In the meantime, there are a lot of really good, cheap editions of Shakespeare. I'll mention two. First of all, one of my sources, the Folger's Shakespeare Library, who owns about half of the existing First Folios, by the way. The Folger Shakespeare Library has a phenomenal series of single volume. I mean, we might call them our quartos nowadays, right? They're cheap, they're easy to carry, they're easy to read. And you open up the book, and on the left-hand side, it has notes and images and explanations and maybe a picture from a performance and all this. On the right-hand side, it has the text. And so you have a good balance of exactly what Shakespeare wrote and explanations on the other side. Another really good and inexpensive edition that also can be carried around very easily is the Signet Classics edition. But there are many, many. For more advanced study, and these are more expensive, the Arden Shakespeare, the Arden third edition, they have a lot of notes and a lot of interesting content there. But really, I encourage you to see the plays. And even if you can't go see them live, you can often find a film, a really great film like Trevor Nunn directed Twelfth Night a few years back, or you can simply find a filmed version of a theater performance. Sometimes the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford or the Globe Theatre in London will just put a camera out there in the house and take a film of this play as it occurs. And watching that can give you a good idea as well of how the play looks in performance.
That's great. Shelley has asked a question about what plays you would recommend a parent, I guess probably designing like a curriculum for their high school student. You spoke about how maybe we're too heavy on the tragedies. So what plays would you actually recommend for a high school student?
Thank you for that question, Shelley. I absolutely, well, first of all, I have some parents on here and maybe some teachers on here. I mean, just to be very frank, there are issues with Romeo and Juliet being taught in freshman year. The play specifically says that Juliet is almost 14. That's problematic for her to be running off and getting married at age 13 and almost 14. Also, needless to say, the suicides that end the play are extremely problematic. I personally think that if Romeo and Juliet is being taught in 9th grade, that it should be taught at the same time a unit on suicide prevention is being taught in health class or in psychology class or something. But anyway, I do think that it's probably a good idea for everyone to be familiar with the story of Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet. Those are absolutely classic stories that everyone should be familiar with. But instead of necessarily Macbeth, instead of Julius Caesar, which is not Shakespeare's best play, I would recommend the comedy Much Ado About Nothing to start with. It's not very long. It's pretty easy to understand. And it's very fun. There is an absolutely great film directed by Kenneth Branagh, starring Kenneth Branagh and his then wife, Emma Thompson. I'll never forgive them for breaking up. They were so good together on screen and on stage. But I would definitely recommend Much Ado About Nothing, starring Kenneth Branagh and Emma Thompson from 1980 something, 1988 or something, and use that to teach Much Ado. I think Midsummer Night's Dream also can work for even 8th or 9th graders. So I do think that the comedies have a lot to offer there.
That's great. I have a similar question myself. If you were to recommend, I don't need to say a number, a few, 2 or 3 speeches for a high school student to memorize, what do you think you would recommend?
All right. Having just said that we don't need to read Julius Caesar completely, the Act 3, where we have the death of Caesar, followed by a speech by Brutus, who just explains very clearly, very matter-of-factly, okay, this is what was happening. this is what we had to do. This is the political reality, and we hope you'll understand. And he speaks in prose. Prose is just regular language, as you would read in a novel, as you would read in a lecture. My lecture was in prose today. I didn't make it in lines, but when Mark Antony gets up to speak, he speaks in Shakespeare's trademark format, iambic pentameter. You know, I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. And the lines of verse begin to march through that speech. And as the speech goes on, he keeps repeating, and Brutus is an honorable man, so are they all honorable men, which becomes more and more ironic as he goes along, right? And so comparing those two speeches, Brutus saying matter-of-factly what was going on, and Mark Antony using verse and using a lot of rhetorical methods to give a very heightened speech. Those are really good to look at. Some other speeches that work very well, I don't know, some very famous ones. Theseus has a speech in A Midsummer Night's, no, Oberon has a speech in A Midsummer Night's Dream that begins, I know a bank where the wild thyme grows. Gertrude has an amazingly beautiful speech in Hamlet telling of the death of Ophelia. There is a willow grows ascant the brook. And those are extremely beautiful. Macbeth has a lot of great speeches in it as well. Not necessarily that I'm recommending every high school student read it. If you're homeschooling, by the way, go ahead and read 20 plays. That's fine. But if you're only doing 4, I don't want them to be 4 tragedies. But Macbeth has a lot of very interesting soliloquies, similar to Hamlet in that way. There's the famous speech, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, that Macbeth gives, which is not to be taken as Shakespeare's view of life, by the way. That's a very nihilistic, a very depressing speech there. And that's where Macbeth is at that point. Macbeth more or less admits that he's sold his soul to the devil to get what he's gotten. And he obviously has a pessimistic and a not very Christian view of life, and tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow expresses that very well as an example of that sort of outlook. But there are many other speeches in Shakespeare that are much more optimistic and much more in line with Christian values, if that's what you're looking for, much more in line with traditional values of a more optimistic sort.
Yes, that's great. We have one question in the chat from Sylvia. So again, a similar angle, asking advice for high school students, but this one is about suggestions for organizing plays. So high school students actually producing the plays. Do you have any advice?
Okay, well, you're going to have to get a good number of high school students together. You're probably, if you're a homeschool group, you can kind of organize it on your own. If you're in a school, you're probably going to have to get a teacher to sponsor you, a teacher to be present at rehearsals for many reasons. You can start with those cheap paperback books that I'm talking about, the Signet version or the Folger version, that everybody can hold in their hands while they practice moving around the stage. Oh, at this point, I guess I have to grab your arm, because then you say, let go of my arm. Okay, so that means I grabbed it. And so you're going to have to be able to sort of read the book and do actions at the same time. I absolutely recommend that you begin with some of the comedies, A Comedy of Errors, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Much Ado About Nothing. Let me think of one more that might work. Twelfth Night. Twelfth Night would be great. You get a teacher to help you, or look online to find what we call a cut version. The play Twelfth Night is great. It's one of my very favorite plays. Festi has a lot of jokes that depend on an intimate knowledge of Latin. I mean, oh, here, let me give you a pun that works in Latin. It doesn't really work in English. We don't really need that nowadays. You can access a cut version online, or you can have a teacher help you to cut certain speeches. And before anyone faints with me saying it's okay to cut Shakespeare, guess what? They were cut in Shakespeare's day. My mentor, Andy Gurr, from University of Reading in England, I was lucky that he came over to University of Connecticut and taught there when I was getting my PhD there. He has a very important article from 30 years ago called Maximal and Minimal Texts of Shakespeare. Many of the quartos that we have are shorter texts than the folio. They probably represent a text that has been cut for performance. For example, the quarto of Henry V, now there's another play with great speeches in it. Audiences love the chorus in Henry V. There's a chorus before Act 1, before Act 2, Act 3, Act 4, Act 5. It's great. It's a really great part. Those don't exist in the quarto. Probably they were cut because guess what? If you're short a person, or, if you can do the play and understand it without those. And so anyway, for various reasons, the quarto versions of Hamlet are much shorter than the folio. If you do the entire text of Hamlet, as Kenneth Branagh did in a film 20 years ago, it's over 4 hours long. Romeo and Juliet says that that this play represents the 2 hours traffic of our stage. So in Shakespeare's day, the plays were closer to 2.5 hours long, and they were cut. Well, there's a lot of evidence that they were cut. So it's okay to cut some speeches and some lines in Shakespeare. So you're going to have to cut the plays, get a teacher to help you, get enough students together. You don't. Let's say that there's 40 characters in this play. You don't have to have 40 actors. You can probably do it with 20, because there's maybe a character who only appears in Act 1, and then there's another character who only appears in Act 5. The same actor can play both with a change of costumes, for example.
That's great. There's lots I want to talk to you about, mostly Richard II, because that's my favorite play, but we only have a few minutes. So before, I want to ask you about Abilene Christian's Oxford experiences and who that's available to. But first, it's just a yes or no question. You don't have to explain yourself. It's mostly for my curiosity. Is there any chance that the prologue in John Milton's copy was like a Milton original, or do we know that Shakespeare?
No, it was in fact printed in the quartos. The quartos of Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet was a monster hit in Shakespeare's day. It went through, I don't remember how many quartos, but several quartos in a few years. And the quartos all include the prologue. Okay. Also, it's just very vintage Shakespeare. Shakespeare had sonnets on the brain in 1595 when he wrote Romeo and Juliet. We had two plays from 1595 today. And that was right when he was writing a lot of his sonnets. And that sonnet that begins Romeo and Juliet is just the most Shakespearean bit of Shakespeare that ever was. And so Milton had a very good memory, and it's possible that he remembered that prologue from memory. Otherwise, I'm sure he had seen it in a quarto and he was able to copy it there.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yes, so Oxford, it's available to Abilene Christian students. Maybe you could tell us who, but then also I believe to high school students.
Okay, I wish my friend Tamara Long were here, who knows. Well, I can certainly speak to the college experience, but before I do that, I think I would like to briefly address the last question in chat, if you don't mind, Natalie.
Yes, definitely.
Because it's a really good question. If you want to read it for our friends who are listening.
This would be Micaiah's question.
Yeah. if possible. Sorry.
I always asks excellent questions. You mentioned that Shakespeare's plays presented the novel idea of marriage for love's sake, and the political ideas presented through some of them. What specific plays and characters would be most shocking to an audience in his time?
Thank you so much for that amazing question. But it's just I say all the time that one reason why we think marriage needs to be about love. Marriage is not about money. Marriage is not about family arrangements. Is because of Shakespeare. It's because of Romeo and Juliet. Juliet's parents were all set for her to marry Paris, who is a relative of the prince. It's all set. And this amazing, relationship of Romeo and Juliet, where they say, nope, we're going to get married, and it is not going to work out, and it's not going to be for anybody's advantage. Friar Lawrence thinks it is, but and that idea that love is what it's all about is very much for Shakespeare. Let me just say one more thing about that. If you look at Act 1 of a Shakespeare comedy, look how many women there are there. Okay, there's a single woman, and look who the woman desires to marry. Not the man, the woman desires to marry. And spoiler alert, you'll get a pretty good idea of how the play ends up. That women get what they want. Women marry for love, which is very much in contrast to Shakespeare's day. Women were not property, by the way. You sometimes hear that. No, that's not correct. But women did not have a lot of rights, and a lot of teenage girls were told, okay, by the way, I found you a husband today. You're going to marry this 40-year-old guy from down the road, Mr. Bishop. What? Who's that? I don't think I've ever met him. Oh, that's fine. You don't have to know him. That women did not have a lot of rights in marriage. And in Shakespeare, women get what the women want. But Micaiah, to answer your other question, what was most shocking to Shakespeare's audience? King Lear. 100% King Lear. King Lear is about an illegitimate son who says, yeah, I know I'm younger, I know I'm illegitimate, but I'm getting the land anyway. I don't care. It's about a king who says, okay, everybody, I have an announcement to make. I've divided the kingdom into 3 parts. Someone in the audience fainted when the king said that. Every kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. Shakespeare's audience knew the Bible. They knew that you can't divide a kingdom into 3 parts, or even 2, or even any number. And then in that crazy scene in the middle of the play in which Gloucester is blinded. Well, that's shocking enough, right? But then a servant takes up a sword and says, stop it right there, Duke of Cornwall, or I will kill you. A servant takes up a sword against his master, and the servant wounds Cornwall very badly, so he falls down. And who picks up the sword? His wife, Regan. Regan wields a sword against a man. I literally think that members of the audience fainted during that scene. And then after, as they're exiting, Cornwall says, ooh, I'm really wounded. Regan, give me your arm. And a man leans on his wife's arm to be ushered off stage. That does not happen. It just doesn't. Call some male servants in, have the men help him off stage. But the world is just turning upside down with incredibly unlikely and impossible things in King Lear. And, parents children who rebel against parents, and the world is turning upside down there in a sort of a non-Christian view of an apocalypse. And now I'd be very happy to talk about, I don't know how strict the time limit is. If I went over, I'm very sorry, but the Abilene Christian University has summer events, summer classes in Oxford. We have regular semester classes in Oxford. There are a group of students over in Oxford right now studying just regular subjects. They've got an English class, they've got a history class, they've got a culture class. They are being offered an ethics class, and just whatever. I think they're being offered a class in football, meaning soccer, over there right now, and how football is intertwined with British culture. And those are for enrolled ACU students. And we do sometimes offer that chance to students from other universities, but I honestly am not sure. Contact me and I'll put you in touch with someone who can possibly give you an answer. I'm putting my email into chat. joe.stephenson@acu.edu. And we do have a program for summer scholars, emerging scholars who are high school students. And my colleague Tamra, who works with Natalie a lot in this organization, is mostly in charge of that program. And those scholars go to Oxford, they go to Leipzig. I think we're going to have some in Santa Fe this summer, but we've got a great program for summer scholars who are high school students. And you can even earn college credit while you do it. So it's a great program. Send me an email and I will definitely get Tamra in touch with you. Tamra's traveling right now. I think she's in Germany right now, if I'm not mistaken, to work on preparations for this coming summer.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you for being so generous with your time and your thoughts and your contact info even. This has been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Great to be here. Great to be here. Thanks for your great questions, everyone. And thanks for listening.
Yeah, thank you all. Good night, everyone.